Welcome, everyone. I'm Alice Knapp. I'm president of the Ferguson Library. And as I talk and I make this introduction, please take a moment to turn off or silence your phones. This is the Civility series has been held here at the Ferguson Library since 2012. And it is, we do it in cooperation with the Dylan Schneider Group and Hertz Media. And we bring experts in different areas to talk about civility in their area. And tonight we have a special treat. Oren is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, where his work on strengthening the labor market addresses issues ranging from the social safety net and environmental regulation to trade and immigration to education and organized labor. He also writes extensively on the nature and implications of climate change and on the process of formulating and evaluating public policy. Cass has written for publications including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, National Affairs, and National Review, and he regularly speaks at university and testifies before Congress. His 2018 book, The Once and Future Worker, A Vision for the Renewal of Work in America, has been called the essential policy book for our time, and an unflinching indictment of the mistakes that Washington has made for a generation and continues to make today. Before going to the Manhattan Institute, he held roles as the domestic policy director for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2012, as an editor of the Harvard Law Review, and as a management consultant in Bain & Company's Boston and New Delhi offices. He earned a BA in political economy from Williams College and a JD from Harvard Law School. So let's please welcome Mr. Cass.
Well, thank you very much, Alice. Thank you all for coming. You have a gorgeous library here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I see my slides have worked. I want to talk about civility in a growing economy and why the way we need to think about actually making sure a growing economy works for everybody is very different from the way we historically have. So we'll start with pie. Pie is at the center of our politics, the idea of what's called the economic pie, that we're going to grow the economic pie, that we're going to divide the economic pie, has been at the center of a lot of our political fights for a very long time. The parties argue about how best to grow the pie. They argue about how much dividing we should then do, but I don't think there's much argument that that's the idea. At the end of the day, the bigger the pie is, as long as you get the slicing right, everybody gets a bigger piece, and presumably everybody likes pie. And that has been, virtually every president has spoken that way since Harry Truman, Democrat and Republican. Both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal editorialize in these terms. It's the accepted model for what we're trying to accomplish. But it's very interesting to look at what the economic pie looks like in real life. So what you're seeing here is a map of the United States, divided up by counties, which each county shaded by the share of income in the county that comes from government transfers. So you take all the income received by everybody, and what percent of it is benefit programs, et cetera, to support lower income households. And this is a study the New York Times did, and in the 1970s, you can see we have sort of a mostly pastel map, some darker red areas, but generally you have 10 to 20% of payments or income in a given county coming from government transfers. And then over on the side, I've included the total size of our pie, $6.5 trillion. Now, if you fast forward 40 years, you get to 2014. This is our new map. And as you can see, the pie has gotten much bigger, $16 trillion in GDP. And what you'll see is almost every county in the country now has 30 to 40% of income from transfer payments, and some counties are up above 50%. And if you sort of flip back and forth between them, pick your favorite place to look at, you'll see everything gets much darker with the exception of certain metro areas. So Greenwich and Stamford don't get darker. Suburban New Jersey doesn't get darker. Suburban Boston doesn't get darker. Almost everything else gets darker. And so the question would be, does this look like success? Because this is, if you believe in the economic pie, exactly what we said we wanted. We grew the economic pie massively. We dramatically increased redistribution. Government transfer payments have gone up from about $250 billion a year in the 70s to more than $1 trillion a year now. And thanks to all of those income transfers, in fact, everybody is better off in material terms. So for all the debates we have in this country about what's happened to wages, what's happened to family formation, if you're just talking about material living standards, the amount each family has available to spend, the quality of and variety and technology that they have available to them, everybody from the top to the bottom is pretty demonstrably better off. And so if we actually believe in the pie, we would say this was exactly what we were trying to do. Certainly it's what our policies facilitated, and we would celebrate. We would say this is terrific. We've succeeded. And yet that's not how most of us feel. In fact, I think most of us feel like the color of that map is a real problem. The fact that the bar went up so high doesn't make up for it. And that telling people who are falling behind, who can't support themselves, that it's okay because you have an iPhone now isn't really a substitute. And so there's something wrong with the pie. And what I think is wrong with the pie goes all the way back to Adam Smith. So this is a quote from Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He says, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. The maxim is so perfectly self-evident that it would be absurd to attempt to prove it." Now, as a rule of thumb, and I say this as a writer who wants to do this constantly, if you have to write the maxim is so perfectly self-evident it's absurd to attempt to prove it, your maxim is probably not as self-evident as you think it is. But this idea that consumption is all that matters is what underlies the economic pie. All of modern economics is done exclusively through the lens of consumer welfare. In fact, work is considered disutility. The goal of economics, of supposedly our lives, is to consume as much as possible while working as little as possible. And it turns out that that is just not actually a very good description of society. So as an alternative way of thinking about what's going on, and that I think provides a better way of understanding why that growing and dividing pie isn't addressing what we need, I offer what I call the working hypothesis. I wanted to call my book The Working Hypothesis. I thought it had like a kind of edgy Jason Bourne thriller kind of feel. The publisher said it had like a boring, wonky book no one wants to read kind of feel. So we went with something else. But the working hypothesis is this: a labor market in which workers can support strong families and communities is the central determinant of long-term prosperity and should be the central focus of public policy. And what I want to talk to you tonight about is three things. How is this actually different from the economic pie model? Why might this be true and a better description of society? And then what does it imply? What would we do differently if we actually believed it? So how is it different? Well, let's line these up next to each other. We'll call the economic pie model economic piety, and we'll put it next to the working hypothesis. So one question is what we're optimizing for. Economic piety optimizes for economic growth. And if you think about the political debates we've had, ultimately much of it comes down to who is going to generate the most growth the fastest. The working hypothesis says we actually want to optimize for self-sufficiency. Certainly growth is good. I'm not here to say growth is bad or consumption is bad or I think rising material living standards are great and critical and something we absolutely need. But it's not going to be the ultimate objective that we evaluate things against. A corollary of that is that we're going to think differently about gains in the aggregate. So economic piety focuses only on aggregate gains, the total size of the pie, on the assumption that you can always redistribute to make everybody whole. And so you'll hear this especially in, for instance, a discussion of trade policy. Economists will emphasize, well, sure, it creates a lot of winners and losers, but the winners win more than the losers lose. And so the winners could always compensate the losers and everyone would be better off. Now, there are a couple of problems with that. One is, it turns out we never actually get to the part where the winners compensate the losers. But even if we did, we would have to ask whether or not we actually make them whole by doing that. And so the working hypothesis would say, actually, we actually want to set a floor below losses. An aggregate gain, a net gain, is not necessarily actually an improvement in our society's well-being if there are significant losses at the bottom end. And you can defend that in moral terms, but you can also define it in economic terms. The marginal utility of dollars at the bottom end of the spectrum is simply higher. And so if you would consider a policy that says we're going to take everyone who has $500,000 and bump them up to $1 million, but in the process everybody at $30,000 is going to go down to $20,000, that would absolutely be a net gain in economic welfare in terms of dollars. But in fact, the people going from $500,000 to $1 million would not have gained nearly as much in quality of life or other measures we care about as the people going from 30 to 20 would have lost. And then finally, it gives us a different way of thinking about cause and effect. So the model that we're pursuing, one of the reasons we focus so much on economic growth is that we assume that if we get the material living standards up, if we get the pie growing, everything else good will follow from that. The working hypothesis flips that on its head. It says economic growth isn't just something you manufacture in a lab. Economic growth is actually something that emerges out of a healthy society. If you just try to do the growth, you can really erode the health of your society, the strength of your family, the vitality of your communities, and the growth isn't going to fix that. The other way around, if you get the families and the communities and the culture right, that is in fact where the growth ultimately comes from. And so the question is, which is the horse and which is the cart? And so to make it especially concrete, I will share with you now the 20% button. It's a hypothetical, but I think it's a fairly good one. So the 20% button is a button you can push. It takes the top 20% of society and doubles their productivity. I mean those who are most productive already. And it pushes the least productive 20% out of the workforce entirely. And if you want, you can stipulate that we're also going to have a program that takes some of those gains from that top 20% and moves it to the bottom. Because remember, the top 20% is more productive to begin with. So what we get by doubling their productivity is far larger than what we lose by pushing out the people at the bottom. And the question is, do you push the button? And everyone actually has to answer the question, so we're going to start with everyone who would push the button. Go ahead and raise your hand. People who wouldn't push the button, go ahead and raise your hand. People who don't like the hypothetical and really want to resist it and feel like it's unfair and they shouldn't have to answer it, raise your hand. Yeah, I did this on Twitter at one point, which is a very scientific sample. Twitter actually is a very scientific sample for seeing what people who fight about things constantly believe, which is what I was looking for here. And what I found was that of 40 responses, 20 said no, they wouldn't push the button. 3 said yes, they would push the button. And 17 had all sorts of reasons why this was a totally unfair question that they couldn't answer. And roughly speaking, I think what that reflects is that we as a society are pretty evenly split down the middle on how we feel about this, but only one half is willing to actually say what they think. I have yet to come across someone who's inclined to not push the button, but feels like that's unfair and the hypothetical is that doesn't make sense. We fight the hypothetical because everything in economics and everything we have done in public policy for 40 years says to push the button. And yet when you actually step back and ask whether it's a good idea to push the button, you keep your hand down. So it's different. Why is it true? Why shouldn't we push the button? Why has this led us astray? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The first is because work is really important. When we think about consumption and production, consumers and producers, it starts to sound like another of these interest groups, hospitals against patients, against insurers. It's different though because every one of us is a consumer and a producer if we define those terms broadly enough. And so what we're not talking about two interest groups fighting against each other here, we're talking about different components of our own identity and the role they play in our lives. And it turns out that work, being involved in production, is incredibly important to the individual. It's incredibly important to self-esteem and to mental health. It's incredibly important to life satisfaction and happiness. And I should say, I think that most happiness studies are complete garbage. No offense to any happiness researchers in the room. There is one very good kind of happiness study, and it's the kind that looks at the same person over a very long period of time. Because now you have a control, you have a baseline. You're not just finding out that people in some countries say they're happier than people in another country. And when you follow the same people and ask them every day, every week, every month, how are you feeling about your life right now over a very long period of time, you discover two very interesting things. the first thing you discover is that we all sort of have an innate level of happiness, and it differs. Some of you are 7s, some of you are 9s, and that's just sort of how it goes. And it doesn't appear to be especially correlated to anything about your external life. And most importantly, you adapt to almost anything that happens to you. So births, deaths, marriages, divorces, permanent disabilities, all of these things cause blips up and down in how people are reporting. But incredibly quickly, within months, people get back to being a 9 or a 7. So that's interesting in itself. The second thing that's really interesting is that the only exception to this in the literature is unemployment. People who are accustomed to working and lose their jobs move to a permanently lower level of self-reported satisfaction and do not recover. And finally, producing is incredibly important to economic opportunity, to actually progressing in your own life. Through redistribution, we can maintain people at any level indefinitely. We can solve poverty by sending everybody a check, as long as we're willing to send the check again the next year and the year after that. If people actually want to be building their own lives and skills and moving forward in life, they have to be engaged in the productive side of their lives in the first place. Now, that being said, if work made people really happy but turned out not to be such a great idea for society, we might want to sacrifice it. But I think what's most important about work is the role it plays in those foundational institutions of our society. So we know, for instance, that work, especially for men, is incredibly important to families. It's incredibly important to family formation. Where men have work, families are more likely to form. Interestingly, also, it turns out that relative earnings are very important, that at least in the economic literature, men and women have different rationales for pursuing marriage, and men working is an important part of the equation. It's even more important for family stability. Unemployment, again, particularly for men, is an incredibly strong predictor of divorce, order of magnitude bigger than what you see typically in the social science literature. And then it's incredibly important in outcomes for children. Children growing up in families that have adults working tend to have better outcomes in their own lives. Even more broadly, just children growing up in communities where adults are working, regardless of their own parents, tend to have better outcomes later in life. And one of the, I think, the most striking statistics, there's a very important book written in 2012 by Charles Murray called Coming Apart that documents the differing social indices for upper and lower class Americans. And it's filled with depressing stats, but I think by far the most stunning was that for his cohort that he defined as the working class, it was roughly 30% of the population. By 2010, only half had even one full-time worker in their household. So when we talk about the idea, you may have heard of the skills gap, this idea that employers are having difficulty finding the workers they need. Occasionally what the employer means is we really need a robot programmer and we can't find one. Mostly if you ask the employer what they actually mean, what they mean is we need people who can show up on time, pass a drug test, show up on time again the next day, understand that 9 to 5 is 9 to 5 every day, not except on days when 8 to 4 or 10 to 6 would be more convenient. It also applies on days when your car isn't working. We are raising children in households and communities that do not have full-time workers in a lot of cases. And then turning around and surprised, discovering that we are not getting the productivity we would want or that our economy needs in the next generation. And at that community level, work turns out to be incredibly important as well. So being engaged in the labor force, being an earner, reduces crime levels, reduces addiction levels. It increases investments in social capital. It increases investments in both physical and social assets in your community, in the quality of your house. And especially importantly in economic terms, having producers and specifically having manufacturers is incredibly important to local communities. And this is a point I want to pause on for a minute because it's one of these ones where your typical voter really cares about manufacturing jobs and your economist, which I'll put in scare quotes also because, I don't know, I disdain economists a lot of the time. Your economist will say, well, that's sort of a foolish nostalgia to think that manufacturing matters. The chair of George H.W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors famously said, computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference? Obama's chair, Christina Romer, said, essentially making the same point. Hairdressers, you said hair dryers, hairdressers, what's the difference? We have this idea that it doesn't matter what people in a community are doing, and we're becoming a services economy. But every local economy, every local community needs to make something that it can sell to the rest of the world, because it wants an awful lot of stuff from the rest of the world. It wants its electricity, its cars, its medicine, and on and on and on. And if you don't make anything, now, there are other things you can sell to the world. If you're a tourist destination, technically tourism is an export. You could have a call center, that could be your export. But by far, the largest set of tradable products that you can send to the wider economy are manufactured goods. And if you don't make anything that you can send to the rest of the world, how do you get all that stuff you want from the rest of the world? The answer is you do what's called exporting need. You export your dependence on government transfer programs because that money coming into your community is literally the way that you acquire what you want from the rest of the world. So when you think about that map from the beginning, turning darker and darker red, another way of understanding that is what you're seeing is an ever larger share of the things that a community wants are things it cannot trade for with things that it makes. They're things that it must actually have sent to it because it has nothing to send back. And you see this if you drive around a struggling region. You'll see the sort of the stereotypical dilapidated shopping plaza. And then in the middle, you'll see the gleaming occupational therapy office. And you'll wonder, what the heck is that doing there? That is literally the community's exporter. It is exporting to the nation's taxpayers care of the people in that community on disability. And if you don't have an economy in which every community, wherever they are, can make things that other people in the country want, that is the system you're going to have to shift to. And finally, production is incredibly important to the economy. I suppose that seems incredibly obvious. But as computer chips, potato chips, what's the difference underscores, our model has assumed that it doesn't matter what we make, that as long as the economy is growing this year, we will then be at a higher starting point to grow from the next year. And the problem with that is that it turns out growth is a lot more complicated than that. That some industries, particularly high technology industries, particularly manufacturing industries, are where we get our productivity growth from, are where we drive our prosperity through. And when you let those things go away, you both lose the capacity to make things and your own capacity for growth begins to erode. So we have a very strange phenomenon in this country where as everything, particularly in the physical manufacturing sense, and now increasingly in high technology, shifted overseas, we were told it didn't matter what we made where. And now that it's all gone, you say, well, gee, why can't that come back? Why can't we make this or that here? The exact same people who said it doesn't matter if it goes away now say, well, of course it can't come back because all of the expertise and supply chains are entrenched somewhere else. And you just want to slam your face into the table because that is, of course, why we should have cared in the first place. And so what your economy makes, that your economy is making things, is incredibly important to its future trajectory, independent of what growth number it generates the next quarter. So that's the first reason that I think work matters. The second piece of this puzzle and the working hypothesis emphasis on public policy in the labor market focuses on a really important corollary of this, which is that markets aren't going to solve it on their own. Markets do some things very well. They deliver efficient outcomes, but we have a problem when we talk about the labor market, the market that facilitates what kind of work people do, which is that people aren't products. And people aren't products in the moral sense, and we could have a long discussion about that, but here I primarily mean it in the economic sense, that people aren't products, and it presents two really big economic problems for us. One is that supply isn't responsive to market forces. So typically, we value the price signal because it shows investors and entrepreneurs there's an opportunity, there's demand for something, and hopefully that gets fulfilled. But you can't do that with people. We can have a price signal screaming for 100 years that chemists are worth more than cashiers in the market. And families can't shift their production line from cashier to chemist. Now, at the margin, we can get training for different things. People can major in different things. But at the broadest level, when you think about the types of capabilities people in our economy have, how much our education system can actually move the needle, it turns out that the workers we have are, roughly speaking, the workers we have no matter what the economy says. And so if we just say, well, we're going to let the market sort it out, we're going to end up with a really big problem, which is that the market's efficient answer might be, we don't need those people for anything. And that's not okay. We don't need that for anything is generally part of an efficient market signal. So when a company goes bankrupt, when a whole bunch of unsold inventory has to get written off, that's great. That's part of the market system. We reward the people who met what the market demanded. The people who did not meet what the market demanded are out of luck. And we thank the market for delivering the efficient result. If we have a social preference for a particular result that's not the same as the efficient result, we can't just say the market's going to deliver it. That's not what markets are for. And so if we have a substantive social preference for a labor market that doesn't just reach an efficient level, but that actually reaches a specific equilibrium, one at which people, wherever they are with all of their aptitudes, can actually do work that's going to support themselves and their families and their communities, then just allowing the market to do whatever it wants is not going to be sufficient. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean we turn around and say, well, then we should just tell the market what to do. Right? So the right of center view, which is, well, we're just going to trust the market, is insufficient. The left of center view, which is closer to trampling the market, which is sort of, well, we'll just order everybody to pay $15 an hour, is not a good long-term solution either. In the short run, if you say you must pay everyone $15 an hour, a lot of employers will do that rather than than shut down. But if you actually want the market to reach a different equilibrium, you have to take a step back. And you have to recognize that a market is essentially a processing mechanism. A market takes the conditions it's operating in, and it spits out a solution. If you don't like the solution, you have to look at the conditions it's operating in. You have to ask, why is it spitting out that solution? What are the conditions that it's operating in that's leading to that direction? And how might we change those conditions? So what does it imply? What do you do about this then? How do you change, what are those conditions and how do you change them? Well, let's start with a few things it doesn't imply. Because I think in our more well-off regions of the country, places like, say, Stamford, we have what we think is a really terrific solution to our problem. One is we're just going to, well, we'll redistribute the pie. We'll send more money to areas falling behind. Maybe we'll even do a basic income. Question is generally sort of, how big a check do I have to write to not have to think about this anymore? And the answer is no check that you write entitles you to not think about it anymore. So we've already covered redistribution. I want to cover two others. One is relocation. The idea, well, if everyone moves to Houston and becomes a welder, they'll be fine. Let's talk about why that's not a good solution. And then the last one is education. Well, if just everyone goes to college, that'll be fine. These two have one thing in common, which essentially says, well, if the market economy and society we have isn't working for everybody, we're certainly not going to change anything about economy or society to work better for people. We really just need to find a way to change people into something that fits better with what we like. And that's not really a good solution. So let's start with relocation. We have a sense that moving to opportunity is key to the American dream, that that's what people have done. And so I want to emphasize that that's incorrect. Certainly it is a component. Certainly many people have moved over time as we settled the country. But not moving has also been part of the American dream. Actually being able to live right where you are, where your family and friends are, is equally central to the American dream and much, 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 much more common. So this is the population of Iowa every decade from 1880 through today. You'll notice every single decade through the mechanization of agriculture, 1880 to 1980, the population of Iowa grew. So even as we went from almost everyone working on farms to almost no one working on farms, at no time did the population of Iowa go down. Maine, straight through deindustrialization, has become more populous every decade. There are more people living in Maine right now than ever. And I think most strikingly, Oklahoma, is kind of the quintessential, Dust Bowl 1930s, Grapes of Wrath, Okies moving to California. Population of Oklahoma declined less than 3% in the 1930s. Farmers were actually the least likely to leave. And outmigration rates, the rate at which people left, actually didn't really go up at all. The population dip was mostly a function of in-migration declining. So while it's true that fewer people moved to Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl 1930s, and I guess that's nice to know, it's not true that everyone leaving for California is what happened then or what we should ever expect to happen. In fact, most Americans, adults, still live within 18 miles of their mother. 37% have never lived outside their hometown. And those with less education in particular are much less likely to stay where they grew up. So we could say we're really gonna push the needle on this. We're gonna go from a couple percent moving in a given period to, we're gonna get 20% of the population to move out of these falling behind places. If you did that, you would still have 80% there, and you would have just removed probably the 20% with the most ambition and drive out of the communities. So neither is it going to happen, nor is it a particularly good strategy to even try. Whatever the future of our economic growth looks like, it's going to have to be more inclusive than what we've been doing. Last point on relocation. Why aren't people moving to the cities anymore? Well, there's, we don't allow housing to be built for them. But it's also true that there actually isn't even a premium to moving to the city. So this is work by David Otter at MIT. If you look back in the 1950s and you look at wages, as the density of a location got higher, so as you went into bigger and bigger cities, what you see is there was an upward slope. The orange line is non-college, the gray line is college. And college grads earned more, but whoever you were, the bigger, denser the city was, the higher your wage was likely to be. Now that held from 1950 to 1980. You see everyone getting nice gains in their wages. And then look at what happens from 1980 to 2015. The gray line keeps its shape, moves up a little bit. The orange line flattens. And it doesn't kind of go up and flatten, it just flattens. We took the higher earnings that less skilled people used to earn in the cities and wiped them out. So even if you actually think people should move to cities, they are quite rationally saying it's an awful lot more expensive and I can't even earn more anymore. Okay, education. Well, let's just send them all to college. Elizabeth Warren has a plan for everyone to go to college for free. This is the most recent data available. 100 students who enter the 9th grade in America. About 18 of them won't graduate high school on time. Another 25 won't enroll in college. Another 29 will fail to graduate in 150% of expected time. So this is don't complete community college in even 3 years, don't complete a BA in even 6. And of the 28 who even complete, especially importantly, 12 aren't even ending up in a job that require a college degree. So for all the talk that, in this 21st century economy with the everyone needs college degree, well, almost half of people who get college degrees can't even find jobs and get jobs that require a college degree. And so by the end, you get to the end of that pipeline and you find fewer than 1 in 5 actually going high school to college to career. Now, can we do better? I think we should try. But we should also be aware that we've been trying really, really, really hard for about 50 years now. All right, and we've more than doubled in real terms what we spend per pupil on K through 12 education. And this is what we got on standardized test scores. All right, the NAEP is the standard nationwide test for 17-year-olds. Statistically insignificant gains in both reading and math, SAT scores down. Now, SAT scores are down in part because more people are taking the test, but we're certainly not generating a more prepared for college population. And by the way, we're not even graduating out of high schools at a substantially higher rate. I mean, even if we were really crushing the college side of it, you'd still have a solid 20% who aren't even completing high school on time, and a significant share above that who aren't really completing with a meaningful degree. Last depressing chart of the presentation for you. BA attainment by age 25. This is from the Brookings Institution, and this is by birth cohort. So the numbers at the bottom aren't year of graduation, it's year of birth. What you can see is people born in 1950, so baby boomers, reaching college around 1970, close to 30% of them achieved a BA by age of 25. Everything we've done on education reform since then, up to the 1990 folks reaching college in the early 2010s, we've managed to increase that BA rate by 2 points, 2.5 points, and not even steadily. So even if we up our investment as much over the next 50 years over the last 50, maybe we'll get that to 35, 40, 50. Most Americans, regardless, still never at any point in their lives attain even a community college degree. And so for multiple generations, no matter what you believe about the quality of education reform, the non-college workforce is going to be a substantial, I would say at least half of the population, and requires a solution that isn't, well, go to college. So what would real solutions look like? If you step back and ask, why is the labor market giving us these worse outcomes than we used to have? What can we do differently? The first thing I think that's really important to emphasize is that our problem is not automation. So there's one story here that says like, well, it's robots or computers or something. And it's not robots or computers or something for two really important reasons. Okay? One really important reason is that that's not how technology works. Robots, because we sort of vaguely anthropomorphize them, the idea that a robot could take my job somehow sounds like reasonable. But a robot is just a form of technology that increases the productivity of an operation, right? Kind of like electricity once did. Imagine how silly it would be to say like, well, electricity is going to take my job. I mean, electricity took a lot more jobs than robots have taken by that definition, but no one would say electricity is going to take my job. And even more strikingly, consider training. Every time you invest in training to give people new skills to make them more productive, in economic terms, that's no different than introducing a robot. But we don't go around saying training is taking people's jobs. That would, again, sound incredibly silly. Increases in productivity are the standard way that we increase prosperity, that we increase wages for workers across the spectrum that we always have. Now you can say, well, this time is different, robots are somehow different, which brings us to the second point, which is actually we are getting productivity gains right now slower than ever. Okay, the period since 2000 when manufacturing fell off a cliff saw much slower productivity growth than the second half of the last century. And most recently in the last 5 or so years, where productivity growth has actually plummeted close to zero. We're not getting productivity growth anymore. So as much as we try to measure it, we actually see no evidence whatsoever that what's happening is that we're taking jobs and replacing them with technology faster than we used to. There's a lot of things, though, that are different. And I'll touch on these briefly, and then we'll do Q&A and happy to jump into any of them in more detail. One is regulation. We, in 1970, beginning with EPA and the Clean Air Act, took a position that said environmental quality was going to be protected at the cost of the industrial economy. Given where things were in 1970, I think that was a very reasonable trade-off, but we continue to make the exact same trade-off and turn the ratchet ever tighter on the rationale that, in fact, the industrial economy has no value. If you pick up a cost-benefit analysis from the Environmental Protection Agency, you will not find a discussion of employment. Elimination of jobs through regulation is not considered a cost because, A, we're only looking at consumer welfare, and B, our assumption is that it's up to the Federal Reserve to maintain full employment in our economy, and so if you lose one job, you'll get another. If we actually recognize the industrial economy as having value, we could accord it some when we decide how much to regulate. Second, the education system, we could actually focus it on the students who need our help. Okay, we have redesigned our high schools as college prep academies. We have taken all of our money and put it into support for college students. We spend more than $150 billion a year subsidizing college. Federal government spends $1 billion a year on non-college pathways, and that amount is down 30% over the last 30 years. So if you're in college, we have $10,000 a year for you. If you're not in college, good luck. That seems backward. We could require balance in our trade and immigration flows. Trade is a place where the rubber meets the road on consumption versus production. From a consumer welfare perspective, more trade is always better. From a producer perspective, more balanced trade is always better. If we were buying $500 billion of stuff each year from China, and China was buying $500 billion a year of stuff from us, that would be fantastic. The problem is if we buy $500 billion from them and they only buy $100 billion from us, we essentially just added their entire labor force to our labor market on the supply side with no commensurate increase in demand for what workers here do. And that's going to have a bad effect. We can do organized labor better than we do now. Organized labor is an incredibly important driver of outcomes in the labor market, and we have a 1930s system that nobody, including workers, likes anymore, and that looks nothing like how the rest of the world does it. We could do it a lot better. And then finally, we could build the safety net around the idea of work. Instead of thinking we can solve problems by just redistributing money and resources, we could say, no, we are actually going to focus on getting people into jobs and use what's called a wage subsidy, which is if you're a $9 an hour job, now it's a $12 an hour job. Here's $3 an hour. And if you do that, you encourage people to take jobs, you make it more attractive for employers to offer those kinds of jobs, and you get more money via work to people over time. Now, it's expensive. Doing what I just described would cost about $200 billion a year. But right now we spend more than $1 trillion a year on anti-poverty programs, and virtually all of it either ignores or actively discourages work. There are plenty of people who can't work and need that support, but if we said, like, you know what, maybe 80% of it should go towards supporting people regardless of work, and 20% of it should probably actually be tied to work, I think that would be a much better system than the one we have today. So I will pause there, or I guess stop there, but then start again soon. Thank you very much, and would love to answer any questions that you might have.
And I have the mic.
She has the mic.
Hey, I've lived in Stanford for 35 years, and when I came here, we had Pitney Bowes manufacturing, we had a Clairol plant, I think we had some other manufacturing. They've all, disappeared. And we have new jobs like NBC Sports and WWE, but those kind of jobs, the people that work there have to have a technology skill. What's going to happen? I mean, how can we change Stanford so the people that are just high school graduates will work and won't go on? I mean, you have any ideas? I also would like to know who's running for politics that has your ideas. I mean, I don't want to vote for Elizabeth Warren either. I mean,
She's a very nice lady.
No, I mean, but...
No, so it's a terrific question, and let me say two things about it. One is, there's sort of a bigger question, what's going to happen? We feel this trend of just manufacturer is gone, WWE is in, and is that just where things are going? And in the long run, the answer is no, it's not where things are going. And the reason for that is that point I made about the labor market, which is the workers that we have are the workers that we have. Companies that are trying to do high technology work, for instance, are facing ever tighter constraints, trying to find the workers they need. And then what you end up with is you hear this rhetoric about a skills gap, you hear about how we need more immigration, you hear all of these solutions, essentially anything except forcing employers to build businesses with the workers that we have here. And that is a conceptual change that we're going to have to make, that capitalism, when it works, is not merely I look out at things that consumers want, design my processes, and then get to turn around and just like I buy all of the stuff I need, I also just buy whatever workers I need for it. Capitalism, when it works, is there is labor available, and I'm going to find productive ways to use that labor that creates things of value that consumers want. And frankly, at the national level, we are going to have to put constraints on access to labor. and that's about trade and immigration, and about saying the borders on our labor market actually matter if we care about workers. They don't matter for consumers. For consumers, more choice the better, everything's cheaper. But if we care about workers, we are actually going to have to enforce borders around the labor market and say to the business community, no, go figure out something productive to do with the workers who are here. Regarding what a place like Stamford can do, you can fix your high school. You can fix your high schools. You can target your high schools at students who are not going to college. Now, there are two ways to do this. The way that is supposedly controversial, if not downright offensive, is to bring back tracking. People get very upset about tracking, right? Like, how dare you? First of all, it's what the rest of the world does. Like, all those, happy Northern European countries, that's what they do. But secondly, the question is, what's the alternative to tracking, right? It's not that we don't have tracking today. It's that we only have one track, and it's the college track. And all the upper middle class families think that's a really great track. If we're really going to stand up on our pedestal and say tracking is bad, then we should at least agree that our single track should be targeted at the median student who is a non-college student. And the families that want to get their kids ready for college can send them to prep classes 3 towns over. Now, if that's what no tracking meant, then like everyone on the tracking, everyone would be on the tracking bandwagon very quickly. So there need to be alternative pathways that we invest in at least as heavily at both the high school and then post-secondary level that aren't about going to college, that partner with employers, get kids into the workforce by the time they're 17 and 18, and get them to age 20 with on-the-job experience, marketable skills, a credential, and hopefully an employer. And doing that well means moving a lot of money away from the college kids. We're going to be just fine. It means allowing employers a role in the education system. And it means telling kids by the time they get to 9th or 10th grade, we're not going to put you somewhere. It's your and your family's choice. But take a look at these options. And hopefully we have something for you, and we're going to push you in that direction. Yeah, so costs, all the costs for those people who don't even graduate from college, because remember, the biggest chunk in that whole chart was start college, don't finish. And I think there's 2 incredibly important things to say about that. One is there's the debt that they're left with. Our student debt crisis is a dropout debt crisis. Okay, for students who take on debt to complete college, their debt as a share of their in absolute terms, as a share of their income, as a share of the marginal premium college grads earn over non-college grads, is no higher than in the past, and in a lot of cases lower. The college debt crisis that we have is all of those extra people we decide to push into college who didn't come out the other side. And there's a question of what to do about the debt that we've created, and then there's a question of, my gosh, how do we, please stop pushing. And along with that, I always try to emphasize that the biggest cost of college is not the tuition, it is the opportunity cost. Not working, even if you were just going to go work at the Gap for those 4 years, what you are not earning while you're in college, because heaven forbid anyone have a job while they're in college now, that loss in your bank account is at least as large as the debt that you're accruing. Before you take into account the loss of job experience and the skills that you're not gaining, which also means now in year 5, instead of being someone with 4 years of work experience, you're someone with 0 years of work experience. So the cumulative lost opportunity and earnings of going down a college track, even if you complete, if you're not ending up with a degree that actually has value in the labor market, that's actually the biggest cost. And so to get away from that, part of one step is this: we need to create an alternative pathway that is attractive. And then I always emphasize it's really important to take the money away from the college track. That it is just about, in a world of fixed resources, where do we want to put our money? But partly it's really, really destructive to say, hey, child, for whom going to college does not appear to have a positive economic return on its own, let us induce you to make that choice anyway. To equalize how those tracks look, the place we want to get to is when you're in 9th or 10th grade and you're thinking about the options. For someone who is likely to be successful in college, we want the college track to look more attractive. And for someone who is not likely to be successful in college, we want the non-college track to be more attractive. And so that's both about building a new track and then about saying that's where we're going to put the money, because in our economy today, that's who deserves the public support.
Any? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Last summer, we needed some extensive plumbing in a house we own, and in Greenwich. And so we got our plumber, and he's inherited with his two brothers a plumbing business, very well respected. They have a few people that work for them. And okay, they're doing the work, and he introduces me to his son, a college student. And I noticed the son was damn good at what he was doing. I said, gee, your son's pretty talented, and he takes to this stuff. And he says, but I don't want him working at this stuff. He's going to college. And I didn't say anything to him, but there's a mental thing in this country. You can't be a tradesman, you're a failure.
Yes. That is a very excellent and true point. The first thing to say is there might be reasons to not want him to be a plumber. He would almost certainly earn more money as a plumber. And that's something that, and that brings me to the more important point, which is the cultural one, which is that we have in our heads this idea that the average high school grad earns this much and the average college grad earns this much. But those two people aren't the same person. That's an irrelevant comparison. What you want to do is look at the distribution of earnings. And what you find when you look at the distribution, I'm covering the microphone, is they overlap tremendously. That the bottom half of the distribution of earners with college degrees has a range below the earnings for the top half of workers without college degrees. So if you're that person at the margin, should I go to college? I'm above the average for the folks who aren't going to college. But if I go to college, I'm probably below the average for the folks who are in college. You're not actually helping your earning potential by going to college. So that's one important thing for people to understand. But then more broadly, we have this cultural sense that, but everybody should go to college. And it's interesting to trace back, where does that come from? Part of it is a misconception about earnings. Part of it is looking up at the high end, right? The tail for the college grad stretches much farther, and Americans, for the same reason you survey Americans and 40% think they're going to end up paying the estate tax or something. I mean, we shouldn't be critical of the aspirational component and so if his son is academically talented and doing well in college, I would agree with him. He should go to college. The question is, if his son really hates college and isn't doing that well and is going to take at least an extra year to graduate, and frankly is really much happier doing the plumbing work, which in addition to being consistently challenging, getting to set your own hours and be your own boss, it's maybe he would also be happier and have a better life doing that. And yet we've made this cultural shift, and what I always point to is just sitcoms. If you look at the Emmy for Best Sitcom, every year through the 70s and 80s, it went to a show about a blue-collar family. And the family life was the center of it, and the dad had some job. I mean, well, Cheers is a weird example because the bar was the family, but the larger point holds even for Cheers, Taxi, Wonder Years, all in the family. You go right down the list. And in the early 90s, it flips. And since 1993, every year, the Emmy for Best Sitcom has gone to a show about urban professionals living in Seattle, San Francisco, LA, Boston, New York, or DC. Most of them don't have families. The one exception is The Office, which won in 2007. But of course, the premise of The Office was to make fun of these losers who don't have cool jobs. And interesting, by the way, none of whom has a family. I mean, that's what that show really misses, is the reason you go work at Dunder Mifflin selling paper every day isn't because it's your passion or how you're changing the world. It's because it's a useful job through which you earn money to support the rest of your life, which is what's actually important. And so, I mean, you could do endless sociology on why that shift existed, but that is the core shift, that is how we now define success. That's how in our commencement addresses we define what a good life looks like. I was actually on CNBC earlier today talking about what they are now calling workism. Because even the people with the really great jobs, for the most part, are not happy. The hours they work, where they have to live, that they can't start or build a family, it's just not a good system. And so aside from all the policy and economic stuff, there's a much broader cultural conversation we're going to have about how we define success.
And our last question?
Thank you. A question about minimum wage, but just one comment about the college. I think there's this sort of anti-intellectualism in a lot of people, because I know some people, older people who are tradespeople, but they grew up in this anti-intellectual type household where you don't go to college. And it's like, I often wonder, what could they have done if they went to college? Because I knew a guy who was a great tool and die person. My cousin's son is, he's great. He was doing electricity when he was 3 years old, but he grew up in this household where it's anti-intellectualism. Like, what could he have done if he went to college?
What could he have done if he went to college?
It's like, what would he have ended up?
No. I mean, does he have a good family?
Yeah, but
does he like his life?
But that you don't know, because
I'm asking you. I mean, does
no, because
he
what I'm
have?
saying is, like, see, there's a lot of people have this view. Like, you look at this old house. Norm Abram went to college. He's a great carpenter. He loves that, but he learned engineering and stuff in college. I'm not like, we need tradesmen, because that's the whole point they have, where you have to get tradesmen. You need to get people into the trades, because a lot of people should not go to college. But then you also get people. There's a guy, I forgot his name. He died. He was in the Times last week, the neuroscientist or whatever. He went on and forgot his name. But he grew up in a household where he, because of the GI Bill, went to college. His father didn't want him to go to college. Neither did his stepmother, because he didn't know his real mother in any way. But he went on to college, so you don't know that. But that's besides the point. But my question is about the minimum wage, though. It's like, is that a transfer payment? Is it raising the wage up? Is that similar to like when Henry Ford paid his workers $5 an hour to make them be able to afford his product? Or where, like, is it good? Is it bad? I mean, it should be $15, should be $20, should it be staggered between things? Like, how do you, if you have a $20 minimum wage, will that get more manufacturing in places? Will it not? Yeah,
that was a great question. So one more thing about the college point. I mean, it's funny, like, no one ever looks at, like, a hedge fund manager and says, like, what could he have done if he didn't go to college? I realize that we have a hedge fund heavy crowd here in Stamford, but, like, sorry, like, hard for me to think of many jobs adding, like, less social value than hedge fund manager. And, like, if he's working 80 hours a week and not involved in his community and whatever else, like, it's interesting that's a silly question to ask. What could he have done if he didn't go to college? And as much as anti-intellectualism is a problem, whatever, it's not just pro-intellectualism, it's to the other side is, I think, equally a problem. But more importantly, the question is for all of those people who try to go to college or get a degree that's just not worth anything. And the answer is like, yeah, he could have gone to college, but it didn't make much of a difference. And we have this mindset in America that, in medicine, in the sciences, we talk about type 1 and type 2 errors, or false positives and false negatives. And we have this mindset in America, better to send 10,000, well, the famous saying is, better to let 10,000 criminals go free than put an innocent man in jail. We've adopted this model like, better to send 10,000 unqualified students into college and have them fail than have one student who could have succeeded in college not go. And it's ridiculous. I mean, not going to college isn't a, death sentence, or you can go to college later, among other things. We should be trying to get a system where, roughly speaking, we're making errors about as frequently on either side. And we are far from that. Regarding the minimum wage, I think the right way to think about it at the end of the day is to recognize that while it is not a government spending program, someone has to put the money in every check. And so the question is, who is putting, if this was someone who was earning $9 an hour and we bump the minimum wage up to $12 and they stay on the job, who is putting that extra $3 an hour in the check? Now, it would be satisfying if it was like the corporations, but by and large, among other things, big corporations don't pay minimum wage. In fact, we're talking about a lot of small business owners, franchisees, and so forth. So best case scenario, we're talking about sort of middle income, small business owners already earning relatively thin margins putting the money in the check. Another answer is other employees put money in the check. We have to flatten the wage distribution and everyone else gets a little bit less. Another answer is that prices go up and customers have to put money in the check. And so there's sort of a first question of fairness there. Economists will argue endlessly about who's putting the money in the check, but are any of those groups that we want putting money in the check? And then there's a question of, well, what's going to happen to the labor market over time if we do that? If it is the employer who puts the money in the check, what you're essentially saying is we are imposing a tax on employing that person. If you would like to employ that person for $9 an hour, we are going to charge you a $3 an hour tax and put it in their paycheck. That's not, I would argue, an especially good model if we actually want employers creating these kinds of jobs and forming employment relationships in the first place. Now, what we know, how much that happens, as far as we can tell, depends a lot on the underlying structure of the labor market. And so for a long time, the model in this country and globally has been, you can set a minimum wage without causing too much disruption at roughly half the median wage. So median wage in this country is, say, $18 an hour. A $9 an hour minimum wage, that's fine, because you're pushing up relatively few people's earnings and you're pushing that up relatively little. If you say, well, let's go from 9 to 15 and the median is 18, then the share of the population that you're catching, the share of the labor market, and the amount you're pushing up starts to become very distortionary. And so what we've done in this country is we've said we have a very low federal minimum, $7.25 right now, which is roughly half of the median wage in the lowest wage markets in the country. And then every state can go higher and every city can go higher if they want. And when you actually across the population take the aggregates of all the city and state minimums we have, what you find is that we're currently at about 47% of median, which is exactly where Canada and the Netherlands and Japan and everybody else is. So the fact that we're in 725 nationally, that's not what to look at. And in some very high cost coastal cities, San Francisco, DC, New York, Seattle, you can certainly justify 13 an hour. You might be able to start getting up to 15 an hour. And we're seeing that. Seattle went up to 11. The best University of Washington economists have been studying that. No negative effect really at 11. At 13, it started to become a wash. People got higher wages, but slightly fewer hours. People out of the market had a harder time getting in. I suspect we'll see at 15 that you actually start to see some negative effects, which would just be a validation that that kind of 50% of the median is a good model. And so I think that argues for a lot of places where we could be raising the minimum wage, doing some good without the distortions we worry about. But at the same time, it emphasizes that like going to $15 an hour nationally, when there are entire labor markets where most people are earning less than that right now, would have costs in excess of the benefits. So, thank you very much.